The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss. It is around 6 in the morning over here in New Zealand, and the world is yet to wake up out there. It's right at the end of a New Zealand winter, and I am ready to dig into 6 more entries for the 2021 Orchestration Challenge. So, let's just jump right into Michael's score right here. Now, as you could hear, it's really fast. And this was actually one of the pitfalls that I pointed out, Michael. I don't know if you watched the second half of the announcement video, but I did talk about how having the orchestra play as fast as the piano part, or as the piano interpretations, was possibly a recipe for the music feeling rushed and for just really being a huge technical challenge rather than more of kind of an enjoyable dancey piece for orchestra. And also that just even if the piece were performed at that speed by the orchestra technically perfectly, which is not the hugest ask, the issue is more about how at that speed, these huge kinds of textures and these gestures have a tendency to sort of clump together and not be as clear, right? So you can kind of hear that happening in here, especially when we go into these eighth runs. Now, granted that there are plenty of orchestral passages where there are lots of runs and eighths and so on, but it's just the particular construction of the music, if you see what I mean. So let's just go straight to the website evaluation criteria. So pitch weight in the upper middle register of the orchestra. You solved that problem. You actually have a very full orchestration all the way through, which, by the way, you didn't have to do. Every once in a while, you pulled it back up. I guess here towards the end. I shouldn't say every once in a while, but towards the end you pulled it back up to that higher register. And that was kind of nice to have a very full scope of orchestration and then continue on in more of a limited fashion. Not limited, but limiting the available pitches to the same as the piano, more or less. Now, as far as the thematic material repeating often in the piano part and possibly leading to a kind of a repetitive feel if it were to be interpreted exactly the same thing, exactly the same way twice, that is kind of an issue here, I feel. Now, that's nothing really wrong with that. I think one or two people were worried that their entries would be sort of judged to be bad or to be failing in some way. And it's not, these criteria are not about whether or not your piece is succeeding or failing or winning or losing or anything like that. It's just something that I set for myself, and I'm curious to see how other orchestrators interpreted it. I would say certainly if you had a much longer piece, right, or longer amount of this piece that you were orchestrating, you would want to think about possibly changing things up, right? Maybe going a little bit easier on the first phrase and then adding more weight the second time, right? That's just a simple trick that I used myself. And trying to keep these two sections from sounding identical, right? That would also be an issue. Now, as to the melodic development soaring quite high, the first time you compromised in the melodic curve for your strings and for your first violins, and I thought that was pretty wise. It's still a little thin in terms of how much weight you could have put on there, but it's all right. I mean, you just have to think, how much of your sound picture are you going to put in there? Like if we take away weight, then we have with this kind of scoring a more trebly sort of sound picture, right? And that was something I was trying to avoid. Sometimes looking at other scores helps me to define a lot of things that I did instinctively, right? When I see people taking different approaches. Now, this is all fine for the flutes, and I like the whole idea of the oboes coming in there, or the first oboe coming in there from below, doubling the violas. One thing I'm not so sure about is that you go to these octaves here in your first violins, and I'm not really sure why you did that, because the second violins do not need any help. They've got the flutes doubling them, and they're going to be able to come through very nicely. So there's really no reason for them to be doubled by the first. And of course, this is going to have to be played divisi at this speed. There's no problem for, especially first violins, to play octaves. There is a problem of them playing extremely fast runs at high speeds, right? So, in octaves. So it probably would have been better for you just to leave this as a single line with all of the first violins playing together. Now, here you've got this harmonic or open line or something like that, and it's a little hard to define what you mean there because of the octave, right? If you wanted the E to be an open string, or if you wanted this E here to be to be a harmonic, like the so like they would be running up to that node. Now, here you also have you indicate an open string on the E. That's not necessary. The player will use their open string there. That's not a big concern. Like, you're thinking, like, I think most players would opt to use the open string rather than rocking over from, like doing a double stop fifth with one of their fingers stopping on the A string and the other one stopping on the E string, because fifths are something you kind of want to avoid. If you can get around it by playing an open string, like in this case, then the player will tend to do that. So you don't really have to mark that this is open. And there's also the whole question of having a high E or having a high A in a critical place like this, played as the harmonic, because while in chamber playing it comes off pretty well, but like in big orchestral playing, it's sort of a weaker note, right? So, anyways, just something to think about. there is something I'm seeing emerging in a few of these entries, and that is that the first beat of the bar feels a little bit like it's, it isn't this big peak and then things are starting again. I sort of feel like this is the rhythmic phrase right in here, and this is the completion of the previous phrase. You know, do you know what I mean? Instead of and then here comes the new phrase. Do you see what I'm saying? So I feel like if there is more emphasis and more individuality to the first beat of this bar, then this can be more unique. And and I mean, you are holding off on your accompaniment of it and so on, but perhaps there could be more, more general weight on the first beat in a different way, right? Or maybe more involvement by other instruments rather than just 3 string groups and first oboe plus the flute family. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, so with that fine point out of the way, the whole question of the upper middle register continuing on, I think I covered that, because it's not a relentless choice, because you have had very full orchestration before. And as to the accompaniment figures, that brings up another point here, and that is that the harp is a bit useless right in here, right? You're saying F marcato, fortissimo, and so on. And then I guess the assumption is that this second phrase will continue on fortissimo, thereby providing a dynamic contrast with the first group of 4 bars as a reaction, right? So we have a 4-bar reaction to the big tutti, and then we have another 4-bar reaction. Okay, well, in either case, there is really very little chance for the harp to come through. You may have adjusted the mix on your harp so that it would be a little more audible right in there, but honestly, with the strength of the scoring that you've got in here, nimble pizzicato and doubling some pitches in staccato accents and so on in the winds is good enough. That is going to have to do, because the harp is inaudible, right? My rule of thumb is never ask the harpist to practice anything that they will not be able to hear themselves when they actually perform. So you have to think, where are the harpists going to be sitting? And especially like that the audience can't hear as well, right? So they might be playing for their own enjoyment, which is okay. Like for instance, one of my favorite examples is during the slow part of Jupiter, the harpists start and they are completely audible, but then as the music rises around them, they're only really audible to themselves. But that's fine, because Holst is going to assume that they want to keep going and they want to be part of it in their own, in their own little group of harps. So that's fine. But in a situation like this, where you really intend to add something to the functions of the accompaniment, it's just not coming through, right? So in big, enormous textures like this, huge rolls, scoring that's much higher than the other instruments, which is not really very likely considering how high the scoring is anyways in winds and strings. And glissandos are the kinds of things that come through, right? So yeah, I think I need to be a little bit firmer. I think I'm going to release another set of 12 common errors. I was actually surprised that video did very, very well. It's kind of a minor. It went minorly viral. I'm a small time YouTube channel. I'm not out there to get viral views, but any of my views any of my videos that goes up to 50,000 in the first month, I'm amazed by. So I might release another one and just really once again come back to harp and just talk about how harp cannot be heard in big textures like this. So that leaves one last evaluation criterion, and that is right in here. That the criterion was maintaining a driving staccato, transitioning smoothly to the next passage. Okay, now you start really well in here, I've got to say. You've got clarinets. By the way, A clarinets, I completely approve of using A clarinets because this piece is in sort of an E Phrygian starting out, and then of course it kind of resolves to an A Phrygian. So A clarinets are perfectly fine. So here we've got our first trumpet playing in harmony with the first clarinet, and they're doubling things that are going on in the strings. Okay, that's all great. And then right in here, right when you have pushed the dynamics to this point, you drop out. And what your mock-up is telling you there is reality. That is what is going to happen, right? It is definitely going to, you're going to feel a big drop there in force. So I would say that just something that that sort of sticks out a bit like a bump on a log is that sudden loss of support. So to smoothly transition to the next section, I would say you might want to continue going with, you could trade off to your second players in both cases if you felt that was, that they'd played for long enough and now they need to trade off. It's all good. But, especially this little transitional slur stands out as well because of the loss of support right in there. So that was just my thought. I like this big hit right in here. I like what you're doing with your percussion, and it's a strong entry. I might come in here and just pick things apart like there's no tomorrow, but that's why I do these, right, is to give people constructive feedback, to tell them how they can build on things, how they can get something ready for the stands, right? So do not feel bad about that at all. But, with those fixes and maybe some more that other people suggest, I think that this would be a very strong score. So thank you so much for this entry. And now let's go on to the next. And now for Andrew's score. So, hey, Andrew, I really like this a lot. I'm going to have a few suggestions. One thing that you're going to notice here is that I kind of chopped up and rearranged your score a bit I guess this is a Muse score entry, so I kind of reformatted this so that it would fit better on my screen. Now, the orchestral sounds, I think, I don't know if Muse Score has a note performer option, but if it does, I think you should try to check that out. That's a fairly cheap solution, rather than buying a big sound set and adapting it to Sibelius or Dorico or whatever. Note performer is, I think was like $130, or I don't know the exact price in US dollars, but it's it's a really low cost way to get into a more realistic sound set that doesn't break the bank or use up too much RAM. Okay, so and because I think that it would be a lot easier for a lot of viewers to understand how this piece really sounds. So let's break it apart. But I'm going to just jump in immediately because it's fresh in my mind from the previous evaluation, and that is just really in big textures like this, the harp cannot compete with this kind of scoring. Yeah, I mean it can double pizzicato and everything else, but in terms of tone weight and projection, it really cannot. It won't come through and it won't be heard, right? So remember my mantra about that. Don't give the harpist anything to practice, to study, that is not going to come through. Now here, you see, you've got harp kind of taking the place of what could have been lower brass, lower wind, lower string scoring, and it is not going to come through. I mean, you might hear a couple little notes here and there, and you could even hear in the mock-up the harp was just really getting swamped by the sound of everything else, right? So that's another possible thing. As the harpist is not an equal partner, and look, and to make things even worse, you've marked the harp forte and you've marked everybody else fortissimo except for the percussion, right? So in a situation like this, it really should be the other way around. Your winds and strings should be marked like mezzo forte, and your harp should be marked fortissimo, right? That is how you would get a balance. But you don't want your winds and strings to be mezzo forte at all, right? This is a big opening splashy part, so you want it to be big, right? I noticed that you've got a lot of triangle, and I guess this is intended to be damped, like, or with the player clutching the triangle as it's hit by the beater. So yeah, another thing I'm going to mention in here is that a triangle is very similar to harp and to celesta and so on. It has a very delicate sound. There are ways of getting around that, but they're no longer quite considered quite appropriate, like triangle rolls, right? So you can have a triangle roll, and that can actually sound fairly loud. However, it sounds like a phone ringing, right? So I think that was it Piston that mentions that in his text. Somebody mentions that in their text, that that the context of that sound has changed to and maybe today would have people checking to see whether or not they turned off their cell phones if they're using like a classic telephone ring kind of sound. So triangle, in whatever way, it just doesn't really come through very loudly in big splashy scoring with a lot of high overtones, right? So I would say, like, how to fix this: just don't really have harp playing unless you're having big rolls, right? The ear can pick out a big roll on the harp, like a huge rolled chord. Glissando, it could pick out. A situation where the harp is playing above the other instruments in an interesting pattern or in interesting ways. Those are ways that the harp can stand out in big tutti scoring, but otherwise it gets buried so easily. So maybe like if this were pizzicato, right? But you've already got pizzicato, so like you might not want to overdo that. Maybe if this were, if you added some lower brass instruments like some like tuba, trombone, and so on, horns, you could have them playing some of these lower parts. So it's just a thought. Okay. So now let's introduce our evaluation criteria. So pitch weight being in the upper middle register, too much, for just a straight orchestral transcription. You went around that a little bit by introducing harp, and then now we've got like pizzicato in our cello and so on. So you're addressing that, and of course, and you are adding more bass as well, right in here. That's not in the original score. So that's fine. Now, the question of the thematic material repeating quite often, possibly getting repetitive after this little 2-bar phrase has repeated for the fourth time. I think you are you're looking for ways to make it not too repetitive. You're changing things around, right? So the question is the change enough, right? If we are basically just taking the A2 oboes and putting that part onto the second trumpet, is that enough, right? We've got this G sharp coming in here, which wasn't, did not appear in the winds in either place. And then here you're leaving out the G sharp that you had at the beginning in in the first violins, right? So the trumpets are completely carrying the mediant here, the major third. Yeah, so is that advisable? Maybe if you had left some of the elements from before, or all of the elements from before, then the sense of building is able to take place, and the texture just sounds fuller with everybody continuing their roles, right? So you could keep in the oboe, you could have fuller scoring in your winds, and so easily, like A2, like everything is A2 playing a single line of music. There's nothing stopping you from writing a G sharp and B right in here, right, and B and E right in here. So just don't be afraid to use more voices in your winds. Don't limit yourself to just a single tone happening at once. I do appreciate that you wrote A2 and then 1 and so on. I think that's great. Now, looking at the whole question of accompaniment figures covering a wide range, you are trading off from instrument to instrument, and that's really, really great. One little issue you need to think about, and that is, here you're doing something really nicely, and that is pizzicato and staccato. So matching the pizzicato of the cello with the staccato of the bassoons. Then you've got kind of a gap right in here, right? You've got these tones here, E, B, E. So there's a missing doubling note right in here, which I guess you're doubling with your first violin, and you're thinking, oh, well, that's all good. Your pizzicato should start right here, right? Not over the B. You should just make them both pizzicato, right? So you could have easily thrown in like this figure right in here as a second clarinet, and then just had the first clarinet grab this top note, because mezzo piano, right? I see the struggle here of getting the sound set to sound right, and for this clarinet note to not be too loud. But look, the solution is just so simple, isn't it? Just leave out the accent, right? It does not have to be accented, right? You could just have this be a normal mezzo forte staccato note by one clarinet player, and then you solve the problem. And these pitches, like, you can still have the accent in the pizzicato of the first violin, and then just have an unaccented staccato note here in your first clarinet, and then you solve the problem. Boom, right? And this is very cool, the way that you kind of wedge into the next phrase, introducing the trumpets, piano, crescendo to mezzo forte. Okay, so just getting back to here, if you're doing tons of fine tuning like this, you've got forte in the melody, and you got mezzo piano and this one note that it just seems too loud in the mock-up, and then a mezzo forte in other parts, and the harp's continuing on forte, and so are the percussion. All right, so you just end up having this mishmash of different dynamic levels. So my strong advice to you is to try to score in ways that are just naturally balanced, right? That, where the balance just finds itself. Now here, I've got no problem with the trumpets being... I think mezzo forte is a little too soft. So a lot of these balance problems will work themselves out with note performer, because it's much more realistic, right? So you'll hear the mock-up and you'll think, oh yeah, right, okay, so that will work fine. And then of course the harp will not be as strong, right, as you think. So that solves that problem too, so as not to score harp in the wrong way. So yeah, so forte forte is fine as a balance against like fortissimo winds and strings and so on, and you can just keep the percussion forte or fortissimo depending on like the kind of instrument you're using. Okay, so on the second part, like just sort of the same comments as before in terms of the accompaniment style and so on. And upper middle register being relentless is not so much of an issue right in here. Obviously, the harp is just doubling what's going on in pizzicato strings and so on. Yeah, so you don't even need it, right? But you might want to bulk up a little bit of these lower notes, I would say, with a little bit of bassoon, maybe second clarinet, maybe even just a little teeny bit of oboe staccato in certain places. So that would be the doubling that I think would be more effective. And so did you notice a sort of a very kind of almost whistling sound in your mock-up when you got to here and you had A2 trumpets and piccolo at 2 octaves apart, right? So this piccolo part is an octave higher than, you're sounding an octave higher than written, right? So very high E way up there, F, starting to get to the point where it's, yeah, and then you do have the first flute in between them, right? But not all the time, right? And so when you separate instruments by 2 octaves, I think I'm going to make this a tip in 100 last orchestration tips, which will be probably coming out in about 3 or 4 years. When you separate instruments by 2 octaves, then the overtones become really pronounced, right? Because the body of tone of the lower instrument is able to fill in the space between it and the note above. And so its overtones become really pronounced. And also when you have a situation where the instrument below has a very, very pronounced fourth overtone, then it really will underline something like piccolo on its fundamental, right? Okay, all right, well, I shouldn't get too technical into this and distract too much from this evaluation, but it was just a thought, right? So I would just say be careful when you have instruments that have a very shrill sound, like the higher you push your trumpets, the more shrill the sound, and of course piccolo is the shrillest of them all, right? Okay, so just be careful about separating those by 2 octaves, because it ends up the spice of the sound can become overpowering in your recipe. Okay, and this is all good. I would say, what does the music do? See, we're looking at these dynamics that you put in here. You don't need to, like, this is strange. You go mezzo forte and then forte here. So in your whole scheme of diminuendo, you are sort of adding a notch here that sort of pushes up above the general diminuendo, right? So in the music, there's actually a crescendo, and then I think I put in like a dotted or a dashed diminuendo, which is the interpretation by the pianist, right? So that might have been more effective than this general, this gradual, this gradual letting off of strength, because maintaining a driving staccato, right? So you've got the staccato, but it's kind of not driving because you're letting go of the strength right in here, right? And would that be an effective transition to the next passage? So those are all things to think about. But look, this was such a satisfying score to look at. You shouldn't feel bad about, the mock-up not having the flashiest sounds. And I guess working with MuseScore, I got a file MSCZ. I use the I use Z now because I'm living in the Commonwealth. So yeah, don't feel bad about any of those things. There's a lot to work with here, and you are really, you are thinking about a lot of different things and taking a lot of things into account. You have a considerate approach to your orchestration, and that is going to go a long way, especially working with concert music, right? I mean, yeah, of course, film music, that goes without saying to a certain degree, but in film music, a lot of times instruments are isolated, sometimes even in an isolation booth. Sometimes they're close mic'd and they're turned up a bit in the mix and so on. So there's all these compromises you can do. You can add as much harp as you like if that is, if that's what the director wants or if that is what you want as a composer. But having that considerate approach, only causes me to more emphatically stress things like the harp not being as strong as you think it is, or as strong as the mock-up is suggesting, right? And that certain elements of music are not actually needing to tail off in ways like this, right? So, anyways, but with all that aside, this was really, really fun to look at, and I really appreciate you sending this in. Thank you so much. All right, on to score number 3 for the B collection. All right, now for this score. This is a very exciting score. There's a bunch of cool things about it, and yeah, we'll just we'll address them one by one. I like the fact that it is in D major or D Phrygian rather than E Phrygian at the beginning. So there have been a few entries that I've seen so far that drop the pitch a little bit, and I'm assuming that is so that that it's addressing one of the evaluation criteria, and that is that the melodic development going really, really high. So this kind of helps the top pitch not to be too insane. Okay, so that might be part of it. I think that this is cool in a way as well because it's sort of it's a situation where there is a lot about the mock-up that is actually telling you how things are going to work for the orchestra, right? In that case, in this case, I would say here you've got very, very strong, prominent horns. They're almost just taking over the music, right? Right? They're just hugely strong, and you have made them all the stronger by having a tenuto mark along with your accent, right? So if you really want that massive, just protruding sound in there, then that's what you do, right? But it really is putting a lot of weight on that sounding A, right? So it's I would just say caution. Use caution because you might get this. You might get this sitting. You might get this to a performance, something like this to a performance, and the conductor will just kind of sigh and tell his first and second horn players to take it down a notch because they're just they're coming through too strongly. This kind of volume, the English horn is almost negligible, right? It's playing exactly the same pitches, has the same transposition, and so on. So, if you really want this more of a blend, I would say score it as eighth notes, as you have with your other horns, and take away the tenuto mark, right? Because it's just really is standing out. And then right in here as well, you've got, I'm assuming, A2 horns. just really just protruding into the sound picture, being really loud, especially as doubled by A2 bassoons. If people know their transpositions, they'll see that these are the same notes. Okay, so that was just something that stood out for me right away before talking about the evaluation criteria. Another one is that we really have kind of overloaded the sound picture in terms of the percussion. I feel the percussion are just really, really strong here, and there's so much going on in them. It's very, very busy, and you're asking your players to trade off quite a bit. You've got one person here. I'm at a loss here because I don't know what is what. You didn't tell us at the beginning what these instruments are, right? So here, this is snare drum because it was snare drum here, right? And then here we got suspended cymbal. You've got right in here, and then I'm not sure what this is, right? Because I can't rely on the mock-up to tell me what is going on. I suppose I could look at the mixer and see how this is set. Okay, and then we got maracas. I feel the maracas are just a bit too much. I just think the percussion just adds a little too much. There's just too much involvement right in here. So the main reason why I am trying to get you to ease off on so much percussion here is that what really works and what's really, really great here is the addition of this tuned percussion right in here, this mallet percussion. I love this little xylophone line. I think the glockenspiel is really effective here, except it goes out of range. That high D isn't available. You could just drop this down an octave, right? And you would still get the overtones and everything else. It would just, the piccolo part would just imply that the pitch had continued on upwards, right? Okay, so one last little thing I will add before getting into this too much is here's an example of harp scoring that works most of the time, right? So these big rolls here. Now, if we continue rolling across, then if that is this, and you just sort of left out your rolls in some of these other chords, then that has a chance of being heard against all this massive tutti. It's still not the greatest scoring, and it might sound better if it were. Yeah, I mean you've got the ottava there. Yeah, I mean it's got a chance. It's got a shot. Here, not so much. Right? This and you're saying let it continue to vibrate. Well, I mean that just when you've got this much pizzicato and this much weight in other parts, it is a sparser scoring, but it still doesn't. The harp just does not really have that much of a chance. So I would say just leave it out. Same thing here. This is okay. I would add more notes, more strings to this roll, right? And then this glissando is perfect, right? That's fine. Now right in here, this is really unless this is massively rolled, it's not going to come through. Okay, now, speaking of rolls, there's one last little thing I'm going to comment on. Do not use the up arrow roll mark unless you're going to alternate it with down arrow roll marks. Like to me, just as a pianist or as an erstwhile viola player, if I were to see an upward pointing roll arrow, I would be thinking, okay, so where's the downward one? I better watch out for that downward pointing arrow. Well, this is the default. The default is the upward arrow, right? So, and that means that you should just use the ordinary old roll mark, right? It's a little strange, but it's a bit of a kind of an acquired thing. People see it in other scores and they borrow it for theirs, and it just doesn't really add anything to the music. Just have a normal roll mark, right? But usually you'll see it in all the parts that rolled, right? So yeah, and you've got this roll, snap. So that sort of works. That yeah, I'm playing my imaginary violin right now. You can't see it coming through the microphone. Yeah, that works. Yeah, so all right, so I talked about a lot of things that did not have to do with the evaluation criteria. Now, let's talk about them. Pitch weight in the upper middle register of the piano going on for too long. You solved that problem fine. The thematic material being too repetitive. I mean, you did add a little bit of variety here and there. Not as much as you could have. There are a bunch of different ideas, like being intense at the beginning and then more intense going on, right? And I mean, so it's just something to think about, especially if this were to be a very long arrangement and you were to continue, you were to come across this kind of thing. If you were to really just have, copy paste a lot of the time, then it kind of uses up the listener's goodwill to a certain degree, right? Or it doesn't really challenge them, right? Or you as an orchestrator. Now, the melodic development scoring going very, very high. That's I mean, you get around it, and that's nice. Like, you don't push your first violins too high. I feel that is a wise way to go. And then right in here, you're having your second come in below. First the first is doubling the piccolo to keep that line strong, and then the second comes in. That's really, really nice. And of course, like, the second is coming in on this lower oboe line, right, which is doubled again from below by the clarinets and so on. And we've got some similar stuff happening here with the support and the violas dropping, and then, of course, the glockenspiel coming along. And then I sort of showed you how to solve that problem of the too high E right in there. Okay. Yeah. All right. So, I just realized that, kind of looking back over my mental notes of what I was talking about easing up on the percussion, is that these changes is what the issue is, right? You've got your snare drum player, and he's going yep, and so on. And then they've got to pick up their mallets and then play this and then immediately grab their snare sticks and be right back in the game, right? And the same thing is happening here for our glockenspiel player. They're hitting a suspended cymbal, and then they've got to put down that drumstick, and they've got to pick up their beaters for the glockenspiel, which might be located in a different place, right? And then they've got to go back to that, and then they've got to go to maracas. So I just that's was the concern, right? I just felt that there was too much going on, not just for three percussionists to handle, but also just in terms of the sound picture. It's just getting a little much. So it's okay for the implication of a very hot, sweaty night on the dance floor with the Cantina band playing behind you. Not the Cantina band from Star Wars, but the Spanish Cantina band. And you can just let that come through the music. You can let that seep through the interpretation. It does not have to. You don't have to be so as literal with it. If you don't, if it just is making the percussion become an effect that the ear just gets used to, right? I would say, like, less is more, right? The more you get more of an effect out of it if you use it just at exactly the right time and don't have too much going on at once. Okay, so accompaniment figures. We got these viola staccato right in here. That's all great. I like the little addition of the clarinet right in here. And then we get a little bit more going on. That's all fine. You're really leaving a lot to the viola in here, but that's cool. Yeah, we have this one little. You know what? I'd say this is unnecessary. If you got any other instrument that could play this note, right? which is basically just like an open string on a violin, right? I mean, just have somebody else do it. You've got, you could have had double basses in here doing something, right? Playing some of these things. But yeah, that's not such a big deal. Okay, so upper middle register being relentless, I do think that it does get to be a bit much by the time you get to here, right? I mean, because things, despite the fact that you do fill out your orchestration to a degree, it could be a little bit bassier from time to time, right? And there's a reuse of a lot of elements, trumpets and horns working together. Now, see, like here, though, I think that they work really, really great. I wouldn't want you to think, oh, geez, I did trumpets and horns here and I did them there, and Thomas wants me to change things. Well, I'll just throw this away. But actually, this is where the scoring is at its best, right? I feel that's the best example of your horns and trumpets working together. So maybe adding heavy brass, like trombones and tuba, and I mean, there's a bunch of ways of making, of spreading things around, making the scope of the orchestration a little bit larger, and so on and so forth, and you can solve some of these problems. And okay, so driving staccato, I felt that was pretty effective. It's okay to play or to score pizzicato higher if you want to catch some of the same pitches as the winds, but I felt that this also worked really, really well. So yeah, so just such a fun score and such a great effort, and once again, just a very considered approach. You're really thinking about some of these things and interpreting them in ways that show that you've got good orchestration instincts, and you're really thinking about the overall picture and the relationships of the instruments and everything else. Is very commendable. Just really a strong entry, and I hugely enjoyed looking at it. Okay, so great entry. On to the next one. So another really great entry. Neal, I'm just going to say the same comments to you as before. I think that Note Performer is possibly a good option for you in having more realistic mock-ups. There's a very clarinet type of sound, kind of a very dominating clarinet timbre to this, and it's not just the fact that you have your clarinet scoring fairly high. It's also just an overall quality of the sound, and that string passage right there that ended the mock-up that we just listened to. It just sounds very much like viols, like the older kind of string instruments. So yeah, so just maybe look into that option. It's low cost. It doesn't really take up too much RAM. Yeah, it might really be worth it. Okay. So let's take a look at this score. Let's think about those evaluation criteria. So I'm going to jump back and forth between the first two screens. Okay, so we're starting off with this fuller approach that's kind of solving the problem of the pitch weight being in the upper middle register of the piano score, right? Okay, and so you've got a fairly big scope right in here. Admirable, right? Okay, so the only question is whether or not the thematic material, which is repeating already, is going to feel too repetitive when it comes by again in bar 9, right? So we're going to jump ahead. And we can sort of see the scoring approach is very similar, both in the statement and in the reaction, right? Okay, jumping back. So a few notes about the overall scoring before we get into the criteria. One is you really have to define what is going on. Like I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, so this is probably intended to be like a drum set. Like a drum set score. Sorry, so this bottom note could be a closed hi-hat, or it could be like an extra bass drum. So like there's two bass drums hitting at the same time, and then we've got the snare line right here, this third space, and then timpani and so on. So and then tambourine. Now here you got the triangle as an actual triangle note head, and I would say like in concert scoring, don't do that, right? It's a good crossover kind of scoring, like if you have somebody who's going to be crossing over between just kind of standard orchestral instruments and like pop instruments and so on and so forth, then these interestingly shaped note heads are cool, but they kind of really don't have much of a place in concert music. The player will understand triangle and regular note head. They'll just play a regular, they'll just play your triangle fine. So really kind of defining what these instruments are. I don't mind people sending in their entries that have combined staves like this, but just really like tell me like snare and then, bass drum 1, bass drum 2, or closed hat or something like that. Just so I know what you are scoring right in there. Because it's often not very clear in the mock-up, right? So like sometimes I listen to the mock-up. This is one reason why I always have people send in their mock-ups, not just because there's a certain amount of value to that for people who are working on their own orchestration and hearing what you are doing, but also for me it helps me to kind of check things and sort of see like what did this composer feel that they were hearing in their own work, right, or in their own orchestration. Okay, so there's a couple other things before we apply the evaluation criteria again. One is this whole idea of writing in the up and down bow patterns and so on. You don't need to do that. You may actually be a string player, so I don't want to critique this too harshly, but the string players will work that out for themselves. They really don't need our help, the orchestrator's help or the arranger's help in telling them where to put their up and down bows. That's the job of the concertmaster and the section principals. Okay, so the concertmaster will go through the score, write in all of the up and down bows for the first violins, and also they may suggest certain patterns in certain passages for the rest of the strings, right? And then the different principals, as part of their job, will go through and they'll their own parts, the second violin part and the viola part and so on. Each of the principals will work out that. So that's really not our job. And a lot of this is really kind of obvious too. Down, up, down, up. Most people are going to know what to do there. Right, and here, see, I would contradict the way that you've got this, right? If I were going to go down, up, down in my viola part, I would have this be down bow, right? I go down bow, up bow, right? I would just have the bow strokes moving the same direction, right? Down, up, down, right? So, or down, up, up. So they're just just having people's bows agree more, I think, is really important. So, but that's a whole other science and nothing we need to get into here because we are not section principals of string sections. All right. So back to the criteria. There is a concern, about the pitch weight, and that is that while you've got these beautiful low notes here, double bass, and that is being doubled at pitch because of the transposition by tuba, and then an octave higher you got the timpani. So you got this big firm E octave down there. Okay, but there's like nothing in between that E octave and the rest of the music that is going on. So you've got, E, and then up a fifth is this B, right? And then the B in the cello and in the bassoon. So, yeah, so it works. There might need to be a little bit more weight in, like along with the timpani line right in there. See, here's where a third trombone would have really come in handy, right? You could have had trombone 3 plus tuba, and then had an E octave being played there, and then the top E would be doubling the timpani, right? Okay, so with all those notes out of the way, we discussed the thematic material and the approach being, the hazards of that being repetitive. And, there's also the question of whether or not something is a progression, right? So like if we have two exactly sort of copy-pasted passages, we lose the ability to say anything new, right? Now, somebody pointed out yesterday that, wouldn't that sort of interrupt the whole feeling of dancing? If this since this is really dance music, wouldn't that confuse things? And my reply to that is no. It is that you can start with the music at a very emphatic level, and then you can increase that level, right? You can get more intense. That is just one approach, right? And and there, many times in folk dances, there will be like there'll be the person starting the dance. There'll be a lot of clapping, stomping, singing, and then the verse will come around again, and everybody will join in, right? So there are, even with even thinking about like the context of a group dance or that kind of thing, it's there is a certain structure and a progression that can be applied, right? It doesn't have to be applied, and it doesn't make it wrong that it isn't. But I'm just saying, in the context of me evaluating your score, and I could give you more feedback if you take a different approach the second time around, right? I can tell you more about your score. Okay, so in general, we've got our oboes low, we've got our clarinets high with the flutes, and that's going to be kind of a cooler sound. But if you've got your trumpets way up high there, the first trumpet, that's not a big deal for the trumpet player to be playing first trumpet, to be playing those high C's and high B's and stuff like that. It's going to wear out the lip to a degree, but you give them some time to recover, so that's not so bad. But yeah, it does kind of blast out what's going on here with the clarinet and the flute, right? So the combination is going to be like if the flute and the clarinet are audible, right, against the first trumpet playing fortissimo up there, then it's going to have you run into the same problems that you normally do with when clarinet and flute are doubling trumpet, right? It's not the most pleasant sound, right? But if you want that to be edgy, then that's fine, right? I wouldn't take that away. All right, so our next issue is the melodic development soaring fairly high, and you solve some of these problems by really not pushing the music all that high, and that is a good, effective approach. By the way, I really do like your trombone and horn scoring right in there. That's nice and strong. Right, and then I kind of don't have anything extra to say about it. It's just the same thing as before, right? So, and then we have the same basic solution in here to keeping the melodic development from going too high, which is just to keep it lower from the very beginning. And I think that works really well, especially the way that you've scored it right in here. I like the idea of the strings joining in. One thing I do miss right in here is the sense of nimbleness. That like you covered that in your first approach. Now you're doing something different, which I think is great, right? But there is that sort of sense of leaping around, and that really is, speaking of dance, it really is a dance kind of a thing, right? So I'm wondering if that could have somehow been introduced in some way by some of these instruments, but in a different way than before. And I just really love this emphatic push into the next section. And the one of my criteria was, of course, whether or not sticking with an upper middle register approach would be too relentless. It's not an issue with the way that you've scored things up to now. But what's really delightful about this right in here is the just real massive brass right in here that aren't too high, right? There's a big thick sound here of combined brass and strings. And here is a situation where I feel the brass is perfect in terms of like the concept of adding this together, right? But it's just really loud. It is going to push out inside these strings. The strings have just got no chance, right? So I would bring down the dynamic level here to forte, especially if you're going to add all these accents, right? The accent puts a little punch at the beginning of the note, and that punch can just basically punch away anything the strings are doing. Now, notice something I was mentioning a few evaluations ago about, dum bum 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 ba da 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 dum, about this really being like the beginning of a new phrase, and this being the end of the phrase, and how it's like it can be like if this just turns into part of this phrase, then it sort of takes away from the kind of rhythmic identity, right? So bum 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 is just really not exactly what it's supposed to be, right? So right in here, you're illustrating how to solve that problem just by having a lot of force on the downbeat as a completion of the previous phrase, and then the new one starts on the second beat. So yeah, so that's just an example of this, of trying to avoid that or avoiding that just naturally. And this is nice right in here, this triple octave. I would say with this much force coming from the brass, it would be nice to at least double like the top of the strings, like having first flute cover this and maybe oboe doubling on that, or second flute. This is nice right in here, though. See, I mean, I see what you're doing here, having just strings and brass, winds and strings, and and having the different groups at different times. This is also very cool. This little touch of horns right in here. Now, just generally speaking, there's a lot going on that I have not talked about, like whether or not certain things are like a single instrument, A2. Have you mentioned those kinds of things? But you have been careful in certain places like divisi, non-divisi, and so on and so forth. So I'm not gonna. I don't want to make that a big issue. I think that you are on top of it for the most part, and that it's just a technical thing. So it's not really relevant that much. Okay, so maintaining a driving staccato, right? There kind of is no staccato marked here, so maybe that is something that you could have just sort of added in, just to keep it more punchy. And really, like you're like you have all of these big, massive things going on before, and then you drop down to mezzo forte, and then the picture, the whole sound picture really kind of gets really simple just in the strings. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it sort of really feels like there is not as much going, there's like kind of not a lot going on really. And so is this really pushing enough? Is there enough weight here to really bridge between the very dancey section that follows, and the kind of the very big shouty section that just happened before, right? So I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm just saying these are things to think about in terms of the scope of your scoring and the proportions, right? So yeah, so just a really fun score to look at, and giving me a lot to talk about and think about. It is never wrong. Okay, so so thanks so much for your score, Neal. Just really enjoyed looking at it and chatting about it, and we are just tearing right through this second group of scores, so we might as well just tear on to the next one right now. Hey there, Thomas. We Thomases have to stick together, so let's look at your score. It's great to have an entry from somebody I've become friends with on Facebook, and is part of another community of friends and musicians and so on, and somebody who's also in orchestration online. And I'm sensing that like a lot of this whole format is new. Like it's obvious that you have worked with concert instruments before, and you've done some composing and notating and so on and so forth. But like just the whole kind of genre, I'm kind of realizing of these entries, the way the score is laid out, and having a mock-up that is sort of lets the casual viewer in on what you're thinking and so on and so forth. That might be more new to you, right? As well as certain kind of notation standards and so on. So I think that I am going to apply the evaluation criteria and some of the other things of other entries, but I'm going to also talk about a few orchestration basics too, to kind of like just to to make this more of a general orchestration lesson in some ways. Okay, so first of all, just talking about score layout. In the notation software that you use, there was a blank staff at the beginning. Of course, you would want to like delete that, eliminate that. You have your winds a little bit out of order, right? If you have a dedicated piccolo part, usually that's on top, and then the flutes are after or below the piccolos, between the piccolos and the oboes, or piccolo and oboes. And it's just a little. There were some things that kind of got repeated in terms of like where, like the this sort of little note about the character of the tempo was repeated and so on. So like those would all be above, and then you would also try to set your notation software so that they also appeared above the strings. That's if you have a really huge sprawling score, sometimes you'll have them appear in three different places. Sometimes people have them at the top and then below the bottom and then somewhere in the middle, right? So you'll see that in, say, a Mahler score or a Richard Strauss score. Now, looking at the brass, it's all fairly standard in terms of the horns, trumpets, and so on. There are a few things that a few approaches here that applying instruments in certain registers and so on, where just the simple solution is to use a different instrument, right? And that is also true down here in our string scoring. But let's cover these one at a time. You've got all this weight right in here, A2 trombones and bass trombone. And I mean, of course, a bass trombonist can play this E with no problem, but it's just not. If they're going to do some of the kind of playing that they're more made for, more built for, they kind of want to avoid notes above the staff, right? It's not that they can't. It's just more courteous to them as players. So, like for instance, right in here, this would have been better as notes played by the like one of your trombone players rather than your bass trombonist, right? Unless you kind of really want that, it's kind of hoarser sound. But there isn't really anything in the scoring that necessarily zeroes in on the trombonist sound in this particular context. Now here you got this one pizzicato note really high in your double bass, and I would say it would be better just to give this note to the cello player rather than push the double bass player way high like this. And the truth is that just really is not a very effective note that short of a string, sort of a really short, heavy string being played fortissimo, and also in a situation where you could easily use tenor clef to clarify things. Like this should be scored in tenor clef if you absolutely have to hold on to it. The trombones right in here should be scored in tenor clef. The bassoons is likewise, if you're going to go all the way up to that A, most bassoonists are going to prefer to read that in tenor clef. And then, kind of a general scoring advice is to connect the beams, the bars, to connect the bars for each group of players. So like the winds would all be under the same bar line, and then you'd have one big bar line for your brass and so on. You're barely using timpani in here, so I'm just wondering whether or not you need to have timpani at all. Right? Same thing for tuba. So those are just some general notes about the scoring. I'm noticing that it's sort of, there's a bit of just a lot of different details about who is doing what, right? And generally speaking, you wouldn't score something like this, like say 4 and then 2 and 4 on this note, and that generally you just put the second horn note in the upper staff, right? And then same thing here, you would add the second note in the second voice, right? And then all we would need to do then is just mark this as 4, and then the fourth horn player would be playing throughout. This is really more of a first horn part, though, right? It should be the first horn, if you're going to score up high like this, it should be the first horn player playing the notes most of the time, and then you just add other players to strengthen or to double or whatever you want to do. Generally speaking, you wouldn't have something like this where you have like the quarter note playing right in here, and then then a staccato on another note, and that's just really it would be better to keep the articulation style the same for instruments of the same group that are doubling each other. And here we got some bass clarinet stuff happening in here. Very high scoring for the bass clarinet. You might as well have just had a third clarinet player, I feel, just to be much more effective. More in the range for the player. It's not that a bass clarinetist couldn't play this, but it is not like the clarino register of the bass clarinet is a specific kind of thing, right? It's almost a flute-like sound, and yeah, it can be penetrating and loud and everything else, but I would actually just rather, if my scoring on my first page was going to be like this, I would have my bass clarinetist doubling on third clarinet and just have this be a third clarinet part, right? And then just bring out the bass clarinet when you really have some lower pitches to double, okay? And, aside from that, it's kind of fun, really. I would say, the sort of the whole mix of of your mock-up is really strange. And that's possibly something else that could be solved with Note Performer. So if we think about the score, right, we've got we've got B octaves, we have got a G sharp, and we also have the connotation of E in there as well because of this grace note, right? That is sort of pushing downwards. So E is sort of part of the chord when you consider like how most people, like most pianists, pedal it, right? So we've got E in the middle, as a kind of an added note, and then we've got the B octaves, and then we've got the G sharp. So if we sort of look at how you have scored this, you really have a huge amount of weight on the lower B, right? And you've got a huge amount of weight on the G sharp here in your violins and second clarinet. And, then we've got these B octaves above, which kind of have no doubling or anything, right? So I would say, like, it would be better to spread out the functions across your upper strings, right? Maybe having like B in your firsts, G sharp in your seconds, violist playing the lower B, or maybe playing B and E together as a double stop. And then same thing, like you've got all of these winds up here. They could be doing all kinds of different things. You could have B and G sharp under your flutes, or you could have the G sharp being played by oboe, or they're like you do a bunch of different approaches in here. So it's not fair to really pick on one or the other. And then we could have that E kind of sounding a little bit more than just being a grace note, right? But yeah, just like, just massive kinds of weight. Now here, like, you can solve the fussiness of saying, oh, this one's 2, that one's 3, and so on, by just having a separate staff for your third trumpet. And that makes everything immediately clear. In here, like, you don't really seem to be using contrabassoon, so I would just say, any instrument that you're not using, just bag it in this kind of, I can't get into your score and make a few quick corrections to make it more clear. So I would just say, like, that would be one recommendation. Kind of make sure that your staff lines, or your bar lines, excuse me, are grouped together by instrument group, and also the brackets and just the positioning of the instruments, and just get rid of any instrument that you are not using, and then I can actually make the image larger, right? So the less the vertical height, the larger the image can be for the evaluation. So not whether that matters or not, whether you want to do this again or not, but yeah. Yeah, and then, so now let's talk about a few of those evaluation criteria. So, like, you have a really inventive mind, obviously, right? Like, whether this is your bag or not, this kind of orchestration, you're just kind of coming up with different things to do, and throwing in different colors and experimenting with them and having lots of fun with it. And I think that is fantastic, okay? However, like, think of how much more I could say about your approach if these two sections were different from another, or progressive, right? I don't want to say like different, but like if the second time that you went over these two pairs of bars, or these pairs of bars, the second time that you addressed this, that there was some, like, there's some enlargement or some other kind of element that you added, right, so that it wasn't necessarily just a straight repeat. And then, like, similarly, like, there's a slightly different approach, but it's fairly much the same in these two bars going onwards. There's a question of the melodic development, soaring very, very high, possibly being difficult for some of these instruments. You are solving some of those problems, and I think that is cool, but I would say, like, maybe instead of just having your strings sort of drop off, maybe there's more support that they could be doing. There could be more continuity from below. And, rather than just having a single line going up and some instruments stopping, maybe there could be lower lines that continue on the energy or drop down, so it isn't just all put onto one specific line above, right? This, which basically the piccolo is the only instrument that can really cover all of those notes, right? Right, and then, just going on the same exact thing. Yeah, you're having pizzicato go fairly high here, right? So it's yeah, it's just a matter of the string length getting smaller and smaller, and the projection getting quieter and quieter. It's, like it's hard to get a really loud, resonant, full pizzicato when you're right up there up against the string length might only be a few inches or a couple inches long, right? So I mean, just imagine the same exact thing on guitar or some other some other instrument that might be familiar to you if you are a guitarist, or if you use fretboard type of instruments. Yeah, so and then right in here we got like more incredibly high double bass scoring, which you might as well just throw to the cellos, right? But if you really insisted on them, you should use tenor clef, and don't worry about using tenor clef for double basses. Any professional double bassist should be able to read that, right? And then like you only have a couple notes of contrabassoon right in here and tuba. It's interesting how much is going on here in terms of this transitional passage. I'm just going to jump ahead to it. Maintaining a driving staccato, setting things up really nicely for the next passage. I think you do to an extent, but I don't know if you have a clear idea of what you would do on the next page, right? So like that, it's not really, I'm not really sensing what this is transitioning into, right? So a few general tips though about orchestration. Once you start getting into the range of the staff and a big tutti like this, the flute really becomes inaudible, and the lower you go, the more inaudible, right? So you might as well just give that poor flute player a break. Same thing with the piccolo. Like the piccolo gets a little bit too low, then in the staff in a big tutti. At the top of the staff, sort of, but then then getting lower and lower, it really just becomes like kind of meaningless to expect any kind of contribution to the sound. So, you might as well let the player just go back to checking Facebook, right, on their smartphone at that point. The same thing, especially I would say with the flute from from anything past this G is not going to really be audible in this massive accumulation of sounds. Yeah, and this is a really high note for your contra, right? It's really kind of it's not out of range, but it's kind of meaningless, right? For what they need to do, or what they're good at playing. Some high English horn scoring in here, but nothing too out of place. And this is all playable on bassoon, but whether or not it is as effective as some of the other things that are happening. Now, the lower it gets, the better it gets, really. And then, once again, you're pushing your bass trombone really high right in here, and it is kind of not the sweet spot for bass trombone to be perfectly charitable about it. So I would just say possibly considering, if you want to use this many instruments and this much weight going on at the same time, considering like pulling your sound, the scope of your sounds outwards, so that the bass instruments can really play in their bass registers, right? So that maybe adding an octave below, right? And if you really must have piccolo and flute continuing on, you can have things be higher generally, right? But I mean, not that makes any sense, because like you really do want this to descend through the registers. So so don't overdo that. Now, there really is kind of no huge issue with the relentlessness of kind of upper scoring. It's just to kind of make sure that we don't kind of continue the same vibe, right? The same kind of upper trebly kind of sound. And in general, like with the mock-up, really the sound of the strings were so overwhelming that that I would just say, like, let the sound engineer and you come out in this. If there's any way of you getting into the architecture of your notation software and just adjusting things around so that you can, just so that you can hear things. So forget about us, listening to this as this evaluation, but just so that you're more aware of the consequences of certain things that you're asking, right? It's because it's just so easy to say, oh, well, like, it doesn't really matter. Thomas will look at this and so on and so forth. But like for you improving as an orchestrator, that's what I am thinking about, right? Okay, now this is just a massive, sounding A, right? So you're just kind of ripping up to this, and we got the same weight with, A2 trombones, and yeah, it's just bam. There's just so much weight on this. I would just say, like, just be careful, right? 4 horns playing that same note. It's extremely strong, and like that'll blast out your trumpets or your trumpet, right? This much weight from there, and then like just this one little F right in here on C trumpet. So think about some of the balance of these elements, right? So. Yeah, so I feel that you're pretty new to this massive scoring on this scale, though you are experienced to a degree with notating concert instruments and so on. So I want to see more stuff from you, right? This isn't something I'm just trying to rush over because you may not have the same, you may not be coming from the same place as some of our other entrants. So I want to see another score from you next year, okay? And I want you to read my books. No, you don't need to read my books, but maybe like delve in a little bit more to some orchestration books. Check out some of the other entries in this challenge, some of the previous entries from previous challenges. And get your orchestration savvy together if it is worth it for you, because I think that this is something that you could get really strong at, just to be completely frank with you. Because like if you're turning out stuff that is this intense, whether it is balanced or whether you've worked things out or whether you have any experience as an orchestrator or not, right? But which has this much, you put this much energy into it, then I think that you owe it to yourself to get better at what you could be really good at. All right, so that's my final words on that. Is that I want you to get better. I want to see this progress, and I especially want you to enter the next challenge, because it is going to be completely different from this and anything else we've done, and from a composer that you wouldn't think would be composing in that style. Okay, so anyways, with that cryptic comment, I'm going to thank you, Thomas, for submitting this score. And, once again, please enter next year as well and pursue this, all right, if you have the time. And let us continue on in our evaluation marathon here to the last entry for this group. Our last score is from Jacopo, and I feel like I'm on a roll here. I think I could do 2 more of these collections today. I think I'll do maybe a couple more evaluations today so I don't use up my voice. But wow, I wish that I had a throat of Teflon and I could just continue on and talk all day about this, because I could. Especially with such really great entries that are so inspiring and have so many ideas that I never thought of. That's part of the big charm. Okay, so I think you have been hearing me apply these criteria and dreading what I'm going to say about this, Jacopo, and if so, I apologize. Okay, so like probably thinking oh geez, I already know what he's going to say. Okay, so I might as well say it. So yeah, like in terms of the whole pitch weight being in the upper middle register of the piano, and that making this section sort of relentlessly high and so on and so forth. Yeah, I mean that is something that you got around a little bit by having a broader sound picture right in here, but there was still a lot of reuse of approaches, and not exactly copy paste, because you have some slightly different scoring right in here. But to my mind, it sort of makes things a little weaker right in here, the way that this was scored. Right there's less weight in the melody right in here, right? So there isn't a really huge difference between the sound of these two sections. So perhaps like you've got this high B kind of screaming out above at the beginning, right? And then the B and the flutes and so on. And then jumping over here, you just have you have a single oboe, and that's really not going to be very powerful. It's going to come through on the mock-up, but it is not going to come through in real life, right? There needs to be more. And what is fooling you here is that you have xylophone, kind of a xylophone solo right in here, kind of taking over a lot of that melodic role. But I'm just going to warn you that that's not enough, right? It might be better to hold off on the xylophone until later, or to really work out an orchestration approach that can stand on its own, right? For most of this, without the xylophone's help, and then add the xylophone, right? So it's not quite as dependent. So that's one thing that is concerning. I mean, the xylophone kind of solves the problem of the melodic development getting too high in a way, but in another way it doesn't, because you're starting off from a very high place. So like if this were, let's say that like some of this were dropped an octave, like say from right around here, then you would have that nice smooth rise rather than the kind of obvious drop right in here. And you do have your piccolo coming in and so on, but I would say maybe the piccolo could come in a little earlier, so that there was kind of a smoother rise upwards. Maybe the flutes could be more involved in this, and there could be more doubling in the winds of some of this taking up the melody. I mean, like, it's so cool that you've got your cello way down here. Maybe this melody could sort of rise through the sections without the help of the xylophone until maybe coming from in the very end, right? It just really kind of dominates throughout here. This is actually really cool right in here, just kind of hitting these pitches, this kind of becoming part of the accompaniment style. I thought that was cool, and I really loved the fact that you have the bassoons and oboes in this sort of triple octave. Then you have bass clarinet and clarinets in a triple octave as well, dovetailing, right? And then you've got your English horn and flutes and piccolo in another triple octave. So I mean, there are some real strong things to this. Like this is just, I feel this is just so powerful right in here, and the xylophone is really well done, right? But I just feel that this was not quite as that this has potential in it that wasn't explored, right? I'll just put it that way, right? The horns are fine. I like the bum ba-da-dum, this sort of bolero kind of rhythm coming from the trumpets. I think that's all very, very cool. It's the percussion is a little heavy-handed, like the castanets and the snare drum. This is really cool right in here on the castanets. Maybe it could be snare drum, trading off with castanets rather than snare drum and castanets right at the beginning, right? It just gets to be, there gets to be too much castanet, I feel, and too much going on in that way in these other sections. So that just takes us to a discussion of the accompaniment figures, and you're probably dreading me saying this, but yeah, like as mentioned before, that harp doesn't really add a whole lot. Like, you know, you've got fortissimo pizzicato, you got horns blasting away in here, you've got the this really beautiful, interesting trading off of these triple octaves across your wind section. Great idea. Okay, and you've got the xylophone blank sort of clanging away above, and so the harp is just really going to disappear. Especially harp, adding harp and xylophone together. Unless the xylophone is playing much softer, or is playing with like soft mallets or something like that, the harp just does not have a chance. Its sound just gets absorbed right into the xylophone, and you could even hear that in the mock-up, right? It just really, the harp was really not contributing a lot. If the motion of these eighth notes is important to you, you should put it in the pizzicato, because the players can certainly play ba-ba-bum. You know, there's nothing that is too fast about that for pizzicato and the strings. And this was nice right in here. This little arco coming in, doubling with the flutes, and leading back into this. And just, you know, once again, it's a little bit light on the B. I feel that the B needs to, the top B of the original piano score needs to come through in the strings somehow, rather than just the mediant, the major third. So, that, of course, we've discussed that a little bit, the upper middle register scoring being a little relentless, but you know, I feel it's not such a big issue right in here, especially with the brass kind of coming into its own right in here. Notice that the trumpets right in here are going to be are going to really like have a great role right in here, and they're going to add to what's going on in the first violins, just with their overtones. And it's perfectly okay to have second violins doubling the first trumpet on that melody. That's going to all add together really nicely. Just back to the harp, the rolls are good, you know. So fortissimo or even triple F rolls, just like really the harp is just digging in and rolling on big chords, and giving these chords like longer time values, right, rather than the harp is just cutting it off right away. I feel that would add something to the music. I like the flutes right in here. I think that's all really cool. Now, here you're sort of returning to this kind of in a backwards way. You've got flute pairing up with the first clarinet. Then you've got dovetailing to oboe pairing up with the English horn. Dovetailing to bass clarinet. Pairing up with the bassoons right in here. This is a cool idea. The bassoons in octaves, and you know, just like, and then adding the oboe and first clarinet and so on towards the end. I mean, it's nice. It sort of has this kind of hooting sound, but the question is, how much does it set up a potential section to follow, right? Are you providing some contrast and then you dig in in a different way to sort of surprise the listener? Is there something going to lead forwards with the winds bouncing around and, you know, being very dancey with maybe some percussion returning? So, you know, how much does that set that up? That would be my big question right in there. So, you know, actually, like, we kind of covered this really quickly. So let's talk about a few other things. So right here, you got this kind of, you've got flutter tonguing with A2 horns on this low written D, and which is sounding D. This is a score in C. there were some empty staves. I've got a note to myself to mention to you that I just, they're, and this is something that I said to Thomas just a bit earlier, and that is like, yeah, if you're entering this and you have some staves that are just really, that are not needed, just really delete them, right? Or like if you have the basses playing pizzicato on one single note and you don't really otherwise need basses or something, or if you have like bass clarinet playing one note that could easily be played by second clarinet or something like that, then delete it, right? So I got rid of a few empty staves here, and it made the score look bigger, and that helps me too to point things out and for people to read it. Yeah, but getting back to this, this written and sounding D flutter tongue, not so sure how strong that is. We got this yum 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 bump brrr. I mean, that's kind of fun. It's sort of it's playing along with the castanets, isn't it? Or it could be a snare roll. So what if you were to cut the castanets here, and you threw in the roll right in there to accompany the horns, right? That might be maybe a little bit more effective and less wearing to the ear. And then you could put the castanets back in here, right? Maybe a little bit. Now, right in here, if you really backed off on your horns, and you're mainly just doing this little melody here, arco and pizzicato and so on, and the xylophone were to just chill the hell out, then the harp right in here would be very, very effective, right? And if this were all pizzicato and there weren't any xylophone here, and the bassoons and so on, these little lines were like maybe mezzo forte or forte, there was like a bigger contrast, and the horns would also chill out, then the harp right in here would be effective, right? So it's just a question of like can the harp really add anything, right? And as I mentioned before, what can the harpist do to be heard in massive scoring, or even in just loud scoring? And those are like big rolls, and you've got some big rolls here, right? Big rolls, glissando, which is so overused, I'm not going to stand on a soapbox and recommend it all day long. And then of course figuration patterns and so on above the sound picture, or in a slot in the sound picture that's empty. So yeah, so those are a bunch of things to think about, and I'm sure that people will pick out some more suggestions and feedback for you on this. It's a very strong effort, and just really good instincts, good real innovative ideas. I just love the triple octaves trading off, and I love the little harmonies between the different groups right in there to keep things fresh. It's just a matter of proportions, right? So I would say, think about proportions. Think about maybe possible overuse of some elements like xylophone and castanets and so on. And think about the balancing in your thematic expression. Whether or not a solo oboe can really hold its own, right? Can it really do everything that it needs to do in this bigger texture with the trumpets hammering away below, right? So consider the proportions of what you're doing. I think that you have got a lot of talent as an orchestrator, and it's always great to see stuff coming from you. I think you have been in these challenges a couple times before, at least once before, and I really liked your score back then as well. So I think you would especially. I think you'll not. I'm not going to give away what the next entry is going to be for next year, but I think you'll especially enjoy it, and it will challenge you in new ways that it's going to challenge me too. I still have not orchestrated it. I have a pretty good idea of what I'm going to do though. So I will look forward to that time for you and possibly everybody else in this particular group of orchestrators. So one thing you could do that would be really, really great is if everybody in this video were to comment on everybody else's score here in the YouTube comments, or if you're, if you are checking this out on Facebook, you could leave the comment there, especially if the other person is also a member of the Facebook group. But or I've got to say the YouTube comments are the most, cover the most ground and reach the most viewers. So if you guys could just comment on each other's scores, and even if you don't feel qualified, like if you feel like, well, I shouldn't really say anything because Thomas has really said everything already, you could just tell them how much you enjoyed it, right? Because that is, that also counts as something, right? If you heard something, if you heard somebody's entry and there was something about it that you really, really liked, please do tell that person, right? And that just makes it all stronger. And also, if somebody's given you a compliment, thank them as well. So it just would be really nice to get more communication, more comments, more involvement between orchestrators, and you never know where that could lead, right? So thanks everybody once again for your awesome entries. This is like so diverting, so interesting, so compelling. I enjoyed this immensely. So thank you, Jacopo. Thank you, everybody else. And I will see you guys very, very soon for the website evaluations C.